Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our workshop on the meeting on the role of algorithms, big tech company in spreading hate speech. We organize this conference within the scope of our project to detect and counter hate speech. And our speaker is Imran Ahmed, the founder and director of Center for Countering Digital Hate. And we will have our moderator, Tirşe Erbaysal Filibeli. Please follow us on social media and share with us your comments. I'd like to leave the floor to our moderator, Tirşe Hanım.
Okay. Is it okay right now?
Could you please choose the right channel?
Okay.
Yes, says the speaker, Tirşe Hanım. Now I am in the right channel. Okay.
Okay. So here we know that actually we all started to discuss how disinformation affected people and how bad people in a way started to manipulate people by using social media algorithms. Here today, Imran Ahmet will introduce us his presentation on this topic most probably, and we will discuss the role of social media algorithms. I will let the scene to you, Imran, so we may start.
Thank you very much, and good evening. It's a real privilege to have the opportunity to talk to this online harms, the way in which algorithms affect our society, and they do so in the most profound and substantial way without us noticing. every single day that the air that we breathe, we know, has changed as a result of industry, and the air that supports our climate and our environment, and that we call the changes that have happened to that slowly over time climate change. Well, something similar has happened to our information ecosystem. The knowledge that we breathe every day, and that forms the basis for what we call society and civilization. And that's a really big statement. I'm saying that society has changed completely and irrevocably with the introduction of new means of communicating information, new ways of setting our standards of attitude and behavior, new ways of negotiating our values as societies, new ways even of negotiating what we call facts. And that is an absolutely enormous shift. The rules of physics, the underlying rules of how we do that now as a society, are controlled by mathematical equations, algorithms, written by and in service to a small number of companies, primarily based in a small area in California in the United States. And you know, earlier when I came on this call in the green room beforehand, someone asked me why I'd moved to the States. And I'm British, clearly. You can tell from the accent and the fact that I'm wearing all navy. But I moved to the United States because there's no way of winning this battle that I fight and that we fight and that generations before us have fought against hate, against lies, against misinformation. The fight that we fight on the side of the Enlightenment, of truth, tolerance, science, rational discourse, and progress as societies. But let me take you back a few years. Let me take you back to the summer of 2016. I was a special advisor in the British Parliament, working for the Shadow Foreign Secretary, a man called Hilary Benn. And two things were happening simultaneously in British politics. One was the rise of a virulent conspiracist anti-Semitism in the left, which got discussed a lot in the media, but they were missing the point that thousands and thousands of people were being radicalized to believe things like Jewish people were trying to bring in Muslims to England through migration in order to rape 14-year-old girls to destroy the white race. Later that year, we had the referendum in the UK on whether or not the UK should leave the European Union. And in the middle of that referendum, that same idea came up again. Apart from this time, it was EU Jews were trying to bring in Muslim migrants from war zones around the world in order to rape 14-year-old girls to destroy the white race. And as a result of that rumor, one man was so inspired by hatred of those advocating for us to stay in the European Union that he beat, shot, and stabbed my colleague to death. And while he did that, he was shouting slogans straight from the internet. Britain first, death to traitors. And at that point, my heart broke. It was clear that we were missing where the changes that were changing our society so substantially were happening, that political parties hadn't realized that the battle was now in digital spaces, that new realities were being created for people, that the rules of what succeeded and what failed on those spaces was written to service companies who wanted to maximize advertising revenue, and not based on whether or not the argument had any merit, if it was a good argument, if it was factual, honest, or earnest. And so I set up the Centre for Countering Digital Hate to look at the way in which bad actors used those platforms. And you know what? For the first 3 years, I worked with the platforms. I went into their headquarters, I showed them what we were finding, I showed them how bad actors would drip misinformation about people in order to create the basis for hatred. Because hate is not something that comes to us naturally. Hate is something we learn. We learn to fear and hate Muslims, Jews, gay people, migrants. These are transmitted socially. We went to them and we showed them how Twitter was used, for example, to terrorize people who advocated, who were arguing for tolerance, to terrorize them into being quiet. Because if you send death threats, if you send abuse to someone, you can renegotiate the geographies of power. That you close spaces for people by using abuse to tell them you're not safe here. We went to them and we explained to them how fundamental values of science and tolerance and facts were being undermined in our societies. And they said to us, we agree. It's really important that we do something about it. And it's only after 3 years, so in 2019, that we realized they weren't going to do a thing. In fact, the very fact that that content, the hateful content, is engaging and therefore made people stay on the platform in a state of anger or rage or excitement in a way that facts can't excite or engage in that way or enrage in that way, that content was the most valuable to them, because if you stay on the platform, they can serve you ads. And at that point, we launched as a public organization in the fall of the September 2019. We're going to turn 3 years old in a month. And we immediately, I think, found an audience that was ready for the kinds of insights that we could give them. And as well was ready to talk about the role of platforms, the fact that they know that harm is happening, that they accelerate and amplify the harm for commercial benefit, that is both immoral and is something that government was designed to deal with. We designed government to deal with common harms. And I think at that point, what we've seen in the last 3 years of operating is an acceleration in the general awareness in our society of the problems. Really important things like the Cambridge Analytica investigation, which was actually headed by Damian Collins MP in the UK, who is a member of the board of the Centre for Countering Digital Hate. We had moments like the Netflix documentary on Facebook, The Social Dilemma, that explained to people in the voices of technologists and the voices of executives at those companies that they know that their platforms are designed to accelerate harm and that they cause harm, that they reshape reality for people, vulnerable people especially, but all people, in a way that can lead to disastrous outcomes. So let me tell you a little bit about some of those disastrous outcomes and what motivates me every day. and I think motivates many of us to attend this talk as well. I don't know if I should pause a little bit more. If my interpreter wants me to, they can poke me or something. Start with hate. Hate is a really good example of a harm that we've seen accelerated and amplified in our societies. Our societies feel more angry. They feel more hateful. They feel more brittle, like they could snap at any time. That there are a hardening of people's opinions about other people. And that some of that work that we did over, truthfully, centuries to bring women into public life, to bring people from other ethnicities into public life, the changes that led in America, for example, to a situation where only a few centuries after slavery could there be an African American president. An extraordinary thing to have achieved if you think about the history of humanity in such a small period of time. Those things seem less plausible now. In fact, President Obama himself has said that he's not sure he would have been elected in today's social media age. The dripping of misinformation and lies, the formation of communities around those lies, communities that often are driven by someone saying something and a group being recommended to them, by an algorithm that's looking for code words and saying, what sort of communities keep people on the platform? Never thinking about what sort of communities does this person want, or is he interested in, or would be good for them, but always thinking, how can we keep them on the platform? Well, identity-based groups are very powerful. They make you feel belonging, that you are seen as a person. And therefore, those are attractive for platforms to recommend because the data they have on how long people spend if they're members of those groups versus not members of those groups is that groups are really powerful. In fact, a few years ago, Facebook reordered the very way that your newsfeed works to make groups more important. That those groups, communities that form around hatred and misinformation become worse and worse because there's a dynamic within them of one-upmanship. Who can say the most offensive thing to get the most kind of likes and reactions to it? Because, of course, the more reactions you have, the higher up you appear in the group itself, in terms of the timeline of when you log onto that group and have a look at it. And that's slowly reprogramming us to say more and more extreme things because we get more and more attention if that's what we're after. And that has a net effect on all of society over time. We're seeing the results of that. Economically driven reordering of reality to amplify the most hateful, the most contentious, the most angry voices. And that is not good for our ability to have safe, productive, tolerant societies, economies, and a world. Let's look at abuse. Do you know why when you switch on your Twitter, if you have the timeline ordered the way they want you to, which is recommended posts first, within the first few tweets, you'll see something that will make you angry? In part, that's driven by other people's reactions. So the first thing that I see usually is someone saying something offensive and lots of people that I would consider my friends saying that's disgusting. And the reason why is because engagement, which users provide, we provide it because we're the ones who engage with hate speech, who say that's disgusting, or look at this, or this person should be banned, or this person should be that. That signals to algorithms, this stuff This is gold. It's chewy. It gets people going. It makes them write something. If they write something, they're going to stick on the platform for a bit and wait to see what other people say in response. They're going to wait for their notifications to start dinging up. So they're looking for that immediate response they're looking for. And of course, while they're doing that, you can show them advertising. And as a result, our timelines are ordered algorithmically, mathematically, to prefer the most engaged with content. What's the most engaged with content? I used to say this to my colleagues in the NHS, in the healthcare system in the UK during the pandemic. It's not your fault that no one engages with your material that says, take a vaccine or wear a mask, because that's just obvious. What are you going to do? You're going to react to it by saying, good job, guys. No, you're going to wait for someone to say, don't wear a mask. And then you're going to reply to them and say, don't be an idiot. And as a result, we've seen misinformation, abuse, intimidation. Abuse, usually people engaging with it saying, don't you dare abuse that person. But you know what? If you engage with it, it just re-amplifies it. It tells the algorithm, this is the stuff that's getting them going. Let's put it further up. Let's get more people seeing this. And that is the net effect over time and over billions of interactions of algorithmic privileging of the most contentious information, is that our societies feel less safe. And there's a Hobbesian, I don't know how you translate that into Turkish. There's, Thomas Hobbes, the great philosopher, wrote that in the absence of the feeling of safety guaranteed by government, we live in a state of nature where all people are at war with all people. It's what it can feel like sometimes on social media. Everyone's at war with each other. It is a Hobbesian state of nature. Abuse also is designed to reduce the geography of safety. I always tell people, think about it like street lights at night. My wife is tiny and slight, so she tells me that there are roads she won't walk down in our neighborhood at night because they just feel unsafe. And the same is true on social media, that there are geographies in which you feel unsafe because you know that there is high levels of misogyny, high levels of racism, high levels of homophobia if you're LGBTQ+, that there are spaces in which that actually will be triggering for you, that will just get you angry and you don't want to feel angry. So there'll be spaces full of lies and misinformation and people arguing about stuff that is just idiotic. I would argue, by the way, that most of social media is just people arguing about nonsense, which I find idiotic, which is why I personally don't use social media very much. But that, of course, limits people's ability to access social media. And why is that important? Because social media is ubiquitous, because it's everywhere, because it's a really important way, if you're a journalist, for example, of how you make sure that people are reading your material, reading your truths. It's a really important way to build your brand if you are a public figure or if you own a business. And it is actually impossible these days to transact business without being on social media. So it actually limits and pushes out those very people that, as I said before, we have spent centuries bringing into public discourse. And let's talk about science and experts and the idea of science itself. Science is a more challenging problem for us because we have seen the real life impact of the undermining of both scientific expertise and scientific debate in the past 2 years. In the United States, after the vaccine was introduced, hundreds of thousands of people have died unnecessarily. President Biden cited one of our reports, the Disinformation Dozen, which you can find on our website, counterhate.com. And that report, he used it to call Facebook killers. He said, there are people gasping for breath in intensive care units right now who thought the vaccine would harm them, and those people will go on to die. That's what happens when you casually undermine the idea of scientific facts, scientific inquiry, the scientific method, which is patient, deliberate, cautious, and well-balanced. Exactly the opposite of most social media environments, as we well know. And I think that that is one of the real challenges for us. Is science, I think, has clarified, and the debate over vaccines, I would argue as well, the debate over climate, which is going to affect all of us, all of our children, our children's children, and may leave the world uninhabitable for our children's children's children. And in there, we can see the way in which misinformation of various types, whether it's outright denial or it's what's called doomerism, which is the idea that it's too late to do anything, so why not just give up now because we're already doomed. You can see the way in which misinformation narratives proliferate, and through that same mechanism that I just talked about, the mechanism whereby the contentious is amplified, it starts to make people see that information more often because it's being amplified. We have something in our psychology called frequency bias. If we see something more frequently, we think it's more likely to be true. Now you can see why that would have evolved in our brains, in our minds over time. But social media hacks that frequency bias. And by showing us misinformation more frequently, it starts to normalize it. If you think something's normal, you might think, actually, maybe I should be thinking that, or maybe I should be giving that more credibility or more weight. And so it reorders the weighting in your mind of how you consider competing opinions and bits of information. So we have a problem. We have voluntarily handed over the way in which we communicate at a species-wide level. 4.5 billion social media users on the planet. The platform, the audience for TikTok is thousands of times larger than Fox News, which everyone talks about as being the end of humanity, you know? And of course, it's not, because it doesn't have even a tenth of the reach, a hundredth of the reach of something like TikTok or Instagram or Facebook. You look at these platforms that have a species-wide effect, and how do we deal with it? I would argue that there are two ways in which we can understand the algorithmic outputs of these companies and what we do with them. The first is to think back to liability law. And an example I always give is the old Ford Pinto car. So the Ford Pinto was a car in the 1970s where if you bumped into the back of it, it would just explode, because they put the exhaust pipe right next to the gas tank. The gas tank's at the back, exhaust pipe's right next to it. You bump it on the back, red hot exhaust pipe goes through the gas tank, boom. And there kept being all these fires and people died, and everyone said Ford should do something about it, and Ford paid out lots of money in lawsuits. And then an investigative journalist at Mother Jones magazine found an internal memo at Ford where they had calculated it was cheaper to pay the lawsuits than it was to recall the cars. It was that basic and stark an economic calculation for them. So let's make it more expensive for companies to create harm. Social media companies, ask them to bear some of the cost of the harms that they produce that are currently being borne by us in society, in hate, in abuse, in the undermining of facts and the loss of lives. And that, of course, is exactly what regulation is designed to do. Regulation is designed in the economics terminology to take the negative externalities, the costs which are imposed on other people of companies, and ask them to share in it. So you disincentivize the production of those harms in the first instance. And that's something that a number of countries around the world, the UK with the Online Safety Bill, the EU with the Digital Services Act, are seeking to do. The second thing is to look at the fight for climate. And look, the thing about both climate and disinformation and hatred and the algorithmic privileging of it is that what you have is that a byproduct, a toxic byproduct of economically productive behavior. So I want industry. You know, I like lights. I like having things. I like the progress that we've made since the Industrial Revolution. I like social media. I like the idea that people can, you know, I moved to America in the pandemic, and I just sat on my own in an apartment in Washington, D.C. with a mask on, thinking, why have I left everyone I love behind? But I hadn't left them behind. I was connected to them all the time. Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, my devices helped me stay sane. And it's not just that. It's also lots of other ways in which social media can be productive and can be useful, but not the way it's run right now. Because it's also producing lots of toxic byproducts, which are poisoning our information ecosystem, poisoning our brains, poisoning the values that underpin democracy and society and progress. And so this is a commons problem. This is a problem of all of our ecosystem, our information ecosystem, like with climate, is being poisoned through positive economic and technological progress. And that requires global cooperation. First of all, an acceptance that we have a problem. You think about how long it took for us to accept that industry produces carbon which is released into the atmosphere. So energy production, hydrocarbon burning releases carbon to the atmosphere. That has an effect on global temperature, which then creates climate change, which then has ecosystem impact. To understand and recognize that took a long time. I'm hoping we can do it more quickly with the information ecosystem, that we can accept that. The free flow of hate and disinformation, in fact, the algorithmic privileging of hate and disinformation, is having an effect on human psychology, which is having an effect at a sociological level, which is having an effect at a global level, at our ability to sustain the values that underpin our society's democracy, progress, science, and tolerance. And in doing so, to come up with a global agreement on how we can work with these companies to reduce the amount of harms. We've introduced something at CCDH called the STAR framework, which we discussed with lawmakers from what are called the Five Eyes countries, the UK, US, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, and the EU in Washington, DC in May of this year. We hope next year to have even more countries present so we can talk about the principles that underpin a way of regulating social media that balances the good, freedom of speech, the ability to communicate across boundaries, the closing down of the shrinking of the world, and at the same time deals with some of the harms. And that framework, the STAR framework, it's got 4 components: safety by design, S; transparency of algorithms, of economics, and of enforcement of the rules, T; accountability, so that you know there's a body you can go to ask for help if something bad happens on those platforms; and responsibility, to be shared by society and the platforms themselves, because the costs can't just be borne by us. Now, you'll notice I haven't talked a lot about the nature of the algorithms. The reason why is, in part, I think the word algorithm has become like one of those magical terms that immediately makes people either go to sleep or get too excited. It's just maths. It's nothing more sophisticated. And the maths are really simple. Make as much money as possible. And do that by any means possible. The problem isn't necessarily that they use algorithms. The problem is who programs the algorithms and in whose benefit. You don't have a racist algorithm. You have an algorithm programmed by racists, by people who don't care about the human rights impact of their businesses. And in that respect, I think what's really important is that over the next few years, we see a new generation of people who understand both technology and ethics emerge. It's really, really vital. I think if there's one thing that CCDH did right early on, is that we combined those two things in our organization. That we had people that thought hard about the moral philosophy of how to run a just society and how to have tolerance, progress, and peace, and combine that with people that really got the technology down pat. And there are generations coming up who, of course, understand that technology like it's basic language. And I think that as we see that emerge over time, we'll find ways to be able to deal with some of the harms that are being produced on these platforms. I believe that events like this, in which we communicate to each other about both the harms that we perceive, but also start to talk about the solutions that work within our own national context as well, and that can work as a global framework, an enabling framework of information sharing, of collective action, are vital. And I'm really grateful to the Foundation for inviting me here to speak today. I'm happy to stop now and start to take questions, if that would work for you guys. You're on mute. How many times have you said that in the last 2 years?
Okay. So here you talk about actually how all those tech companies use personal recommendation engines to optimize the time that we spend, and then to show us, I don't know, more ads. And in that way, they manipulate us at the end, isn't it? And they spread hate speech, they spread disinformation, etc., etc. Here, I have some concerns about the policies of social media platforms, actually, because they said that they are saying that they are already fighting against hate speech according to their policies, because they have some policies. But on the other hand, in many countries, they try to develop some, law and regulation against the spread of disinformation and hate speech on social media platforms. And on the other hand, you talk about Digital Services Act. And on the other hand, we know that there is another law prepared by European Union, Digital Market Act, and they are already working on P2B. This is the regulation of platform to business relation, etc. They try to regulate everything, actually, in the European Union side. So here I have some concerns because here in Turkey, for example, they are trying to develop a kind of law and regulation. But on the other hand, we know that they don't want to regulate social media platforms. They want to regulate and somehow people because, you know, for example, here in Turkey, we have unfortunately no mainstream media, and for this reason, alternative media function better than other countries, and alternative media outlets need those social media platforms, and that way they try to, in a way, regulate this digital native alternative media outlets, you know, and it's because of this regulation, we have some concerns on the freedom of expression. I don't know how about, for example, in USA or in UK or in European Union countries, those kind of regulations may help to regulate in a way the spread of, I don't know, in a way, and that way you may start a fight against the spread of disinformation or hate speech. But I don't know how it will function countries like Turkey. What do you think about it?
Well, look, I mean, the freedom of speech, of course, in the US is protected by the First Amendment to the Constitution. And it's like coming up with frameworks that work, because freedom of speech is a really important thing. It also, it elevates voices and gives a voice to those communities that might feel otherwise unable to do so. I think there are three elements here that I think are worth unpacking from what you said. So let's talk about the platforms, and they say that they are already trying to reduce the amount of hate speech. One problem there is language, that they don't actually have any, experience or understanding of other languages, and they are reluctant to hire people to do the job. The second is that actually a lot of their rules aren't enforced. So let me give you one example from something we just did. Twitter, Facebook, all the major companies a few weeks ago made a big announcement that they would take action against posts that were repeating certain anti-gay slurs in the US about how gay people were grooming children for child sexual exploitation. We then went back and we just reported a few hundred posts to the platform using their own platform reporting tools. And then we went back and checked what action was taken. 99% of the time, so 99 out of 100 times, no action was taken. We did a report last year on Islamophobia. So the platforms say it's wrong, that they do not permit hatred against Muslim people. Because of course, platforms aren't designed for free speech. They have rules. You all sign up to them when you join them. They're community standards. You all agree to respect them. But of course, that's your responsibility as a user, it's your right as a user as well to expect that others are observing those responsibilities. And if you look at the enforcement of their rules against Muslim hatred, 95% of the time, nothing is done about extreme anti-Muslim hatred when we report it to them. So we've tested whether or not they're telling the truth about their moderation practices. And then we come to government. And look, there's a reason why in our STAR framework, safety by design, so doing safety assessments before you launch products and launch new products and new features, transparency, so that we understand in whose name and how is information being manipulated by your algorithms and how do they work. Accountability, so there's someone that you can go and speak to about problems that are happening there, having bodies that think about this properly, and responsibility for any actual harm being done to people being shared. What we don't talk about is content moderation, because actually that's a decision that platforms can take for themselves based on their own stated rules. And I think that's really important, is that government should keep its nose out of what we think and what we say, but it absolutely has a right to talk about. So that's freedom of speech, but it has a right to talk about the freedom of reach, how far misinformation, hatred is being amplified as a commercial decision. And that's the point where it goes beyond our freedoms as individuals to hold opinions and to express those opinions, and the way in which that's commercialized at scale and distributed, published to billions of people, that the rules change.
And by the way, yesterday I faced something very interesting. I applied to academic for research. It's really interesting. And my colleagues told me that recently some of my colleagues applied for some research to Twitter academic. And they said that Twitter academic always reject people here in Turkey, they said so. And anyway, I applied for it and they rejected me and they attached the policy, and on the policy directly somewhere, and it was saying that according to their policies, they are fighting against violence and hate speech on social media platforms. But the interesting thing is this: the study that I wanted to conduct was about hate speech spread on refugees on Twitter. So it was very interesting for me because I do not somehow I don't understand the approach, how they decide which academic research should be supported by them. And anyway, I will harvest the data because there are some tools, as most of the people know, but I don't understand their policies. And at that point, I would like to ask you, for example, to fight against misinformation and hate speech, we need to work together. But how we can, in a way, create a kind of organism, to fight against together? Because I think social media platforms, academics, and I don't know, NGOs like yours should work together, and on the other hand, by the way, computer scientists as well, because we need computer scientists and social scientists at the same time. So I don't know how we can create such, organism to fight against the spread of disinformation. Anyway, you have some ideas about it?
I mean, yeah. My research team, we had a meeting last week with the research team to talk about the transparency they wish. The question we asked them was, what do you wish you had? And it was both interesting and depressing listening to them, because what we have is so far from what they'd like in order to do their jobs properly. The truth is that platform transparency has been reducing over time. If you look at, for example, CrowdTangle and the Facebook decision to no longer support CrowdTangle, which is a vital tool in giving us understanding of the reach of individual posts and the prevalence with which links are being shared on those platforms. So it gives you insight into how content is being mass distributed in a concerted and calculated way by bad actors to maximize the visibility of misinformation narratives. We no longer have that tool fully available to us. And so there has been a reduction over time in transparency of the platforms. And there are various initiatives around that I've seen, some of them saying so this is a good example of where you need government to step in to force transparency. And of course, we have lots of rules for lots of companies that force transparency. I run a US charity. The amount of time I spend telling people where my money comes from, how we're spending it, is to the government, to the IRS, to the in various forms that we submit, is unbelievable. There's almost complete transparency as to how we are organized, and yet some of the world's biggest companies that have a democratic impact are able to hide fundamental things like how they decide what wins and what doesn't on their platform. And I think that these are really problematic given the species-wide effect of these companies, that we need to have more transparency from them. Some of the initiatives around the world on transparency say that academics should be given access. Some say civil society organizations like my own should be given access to. Some just say regulators only. I would say all three. Regulators should, academics should, and civil society organizations, because we're good at different bits of analyzing the harms being created. And it's something that we are really eager that the EU gets right. I am quite worried about the EU's transparency being only about academics. And I think that if you think about the time it takes for proper scientific inquiry to happen, to be peer reviewed, to be published, you can't be operating at that speed to identify harms in a world in which we're not just in a 24-hour news cycle, we're in a microsecond by microsecond, never-ending news cycle.
And you know what? Actually, when I investigating how can I harvest data, I found something very interesting because we are talking about the capital of social media platforms at the same time. Here, for example, there are some companies who already paid some amount of money to those social media platforms. Here we are talking about transparency, but on the other hand, they paid some amount of money to those social media platforms and harvested some kind of data on popular topics, like, I don't know, maybe people will do some research about those topics in the future, or they will need this information or data to, in a way, I don't know, investigate something, I don't know. And here they are selling this data to the people. This is also very interesting, isn't it? So when we talk about transparency, we don't know to whom they are selling the data that they have, by the way. So data is the most important asset, not the oil. By saying this, actually, sentence, they are very right about it. Maybe I am not sure, but as we see right now, this is true, isn't it?
Well, I mean, if you really want to understand Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, you don't go to the website and use it. You go to the advertising portal and buy from it. And then you understand the power of those platforms. So, like, one of the exercises that we do for our researchers is say, don't just look at Twitter. I mean, that's the front end. The real access you get is as one of their customers. And you're not a customer as a user. You're the product.
Yes, we are the product, because we are giving our information about ourselves in a free way to use the platform in free.
So 98% of Meta's revenues come from advertising. 98%. And, a few years ago, we were involved with the Stop Hate for Profit coalition that persuaded lots of big companies like Disney and Coca-Cola and Ben & Jerry's to stop advertising for a month on Facebook because of the hatred that was spreading on those platforms that was leading to, it led to, the environment in which George Floyd's murder occurred in the US, which led to the Black Lives Matter movement. And we got hundreds of companies to sign up, and that has an impact, right? Because that's where they get their revenues from. And so I think it's, when I say it's the whole of society that needs to be able to respond to it, it's not just governments, it's advertisers as well, have an enormous amount of impact on those companies. Super users. So we work really extensively at CCDH with Selena Gomez, who's one of the biggest social media stars in the world. She has 550 million followers across her platforms. When she writes a letter to Sheryl Sandberg, it's taken seriously. And so we're always looking at ways in which we've got leverage over those companies. And I think it's really vital that we all think about our responsibilities as users and as commentators to try and get them to do the right thing.
All right. So do we have questions, by the way, from the participants? What are your recommendations, by the way? For example, can we, I asked it once upon a time when I was conducting another research, I asked it to computer scientists, can we, I don't know, develop some kind of reverse algorithms to not to see, those kind of rhetorics, hatred rhetorics. And they said it's almost impossible. What do you think about it?
Look, I do think it's going to be a new field of business ethics, and it's interesting because we're at the moment trying to work out if we want to do an alliance with a university. And my team was saying we should. MIT's got a great technology lab, Stanford's got a great technology lab. And I said we should be doing it with a business school, because that's where the executives who'll be making these decisions will be coming from. It's the truth. And so, you know, do it with Wharton, don't do it with MIT. And I think that that's actually the next evolution for us, is going to have to be in looking at the technology impacts of the ethical impacts of the technology. You know, this to me is something, it's a discussion we've been having for 30 years. And I remember, like, back at college, university 20 years ago, studying Ulrich Beck, who wrote about the risk society and about how man-made risk is now the primary risks, exogenous risks that we have to our life, that these are often the negative consequences of scientific progress and technological progress, and how that affects us, our psychology, our societies as a whole. And I think that a lot of these questions of what is acceptable in the name of profit and capitalism are really big, chewy, fundamental questions. I'm not sure there's a technology solution to this problem, because the problem isn't that we've got technology. The problem is how that technology is being used and the ethics of the people that do that. And you can see the differences in, for example, the way that Apple operates and that Facebook operates, right? Apple has done a ton of work on trying to protect our data and trying to give us more capacity to protect our privacy, and the way in which our privacy is harvested by third-party organizations, often unwittingly to us, so that we don't recognize the extent to which our data is being taken, stored, and then sold. And then Facebook, which is absolutely ruthless in sucking every bit of data from you. I mean, when you tell people about the Facebook tracking pixel, that's one of my favorite things to do. And people just sit there going, oh no. So yeah, I mean, and you know, this is becoming a more acute problem. I think there's another reason why I'm in the United States. There's also antitrust. So you think about, for example, right now, Amazon buying Roomba, so they've got detailed maps of your home, buying One Medical, who provide my healthcare services, so they have all of my healthcare data as well. Like, you just think,
they are sharing data.
What in one company? Why are you aggregating so much of my personal data? You know, so yeah.
And here is the problem, by the way. People are biased, we know it, and people are coding these algorithms. Here, when we talk about reverse algorithms, again, people will write it. So I don't know, this kind of algorithm will work in the function that we aim. So it creates a kind of problem, I think. I don't know what you think about it, because in all the documentaries, all the discussions, we're always discussing it, isn't people are biased. And there's an implicit test that Harvard University's implicit test. And when I take the test, I think that I'm not biased. And I was biased, basically. When I took the test, the results showed me that. So, and I'm giving a course here at Bahçeşehir University, Media, Diversity and Discrimination. And on this course, I make my students take tests, and they said that we are not racist, we are not xenophobic, etc., etc. But they took the test, they are biased, by the way, against some certain group of people, actually. We see it. And here people are coding algorithms, and for this reason, anyway, it's going to be biased. I don't know, what do you think about it?
Sure. And, you know, some of that is like, you know, George Clooney grows a beard and he's even more rugged. I grow a beard and people start crossing the street. You know, there's a reason why we have these biases and they're coded into our society. I think about this all the time as I'm Muslim origin. I'm a brown guy living in the United States, growing up in the United Kingdom. But you think about the misogyny and the way in which women are situated in our societies. You think about the sorts of biases that we are aware of, and those unconscious biases as well. The way that, you know, all of us do code those in. And you would think that for companies that provide the image of being young, progressive, trying to make the world a better place. We're science-based and we want the world to be more scientific, more technologically brilliant, that they would try and ensure that good information wins over misinformation. You would actually think that that's the way that their biases would go, but it ain't true. And I think you do have a choice on what content wins and what doesn't. We know that through publishing, through conventional publishing. Like even this today, there's a reason why you asked me to speak and not say, I don't know, someone else who doesn't know about this topic. It's because you chose to have someone that's thought about it for a long period of time. And there are ways in which you could advantage, for example, good information over bad information, but they choose not to focus on that because for them, it's really simple. To flatten the world and to allow the loudest and most contentious voices to succeed, they know they've created an attention suck because they've got to compete against other platforms that want your attention. You know, whether that's your kids, it's Netflix, or it's, you know, something else. And so for them, it is all about how do we win in this very, very complicated and difficult battle.
So we need to promote good information, isn't it?
I think there's really easy ways of doing it as well. You know, I suggested to the platforms recently that next to, for example, there's a big problem of illegitimate healthcare providers providing fake healthcare information on those platforms. So I said, why don't you allow doctors who've got a registration with the medical council to have a blue, there's it's called a codicil. It's the two snakes around a staff, the universal symbol of medicine. Why don't you allow them to have a blue codicil next to their profile to say this is a registered healthcare provider who's at least got an MBBS, you know, or an MBCHB, has been to medical school and understands what they're talking about. Why don't you do that next to a registered healthcare clinic? So we can start to bring in some of the, you know, in the same way that someone wears a white coat and is called doctor and has a clinic, and you know that's a doctor. How do we bring in some of those symbols of epistemic, of weight, of expertise from the offline world into the online world as well? You know, their reaction was, it's not for us to decide who's a doctor. You're like, there are easy ways you could do that, guys, but they just don't care. True.
So if we think about artificial intelligence, how we can use artificial intelligence to detect hate speech, and I'm not sure it could be useful because, you know, at the end, the artificial intelligence will do sentiment analysis in a way, and it's really hard to code everything there, you know. But I'm not sure. There are some paths actually they code some artificial intelligence tools to detect hate speech, etc. And recently, I think social media platforms working on it. By the way, not only non-governmental organizations. At the end, what do you think about it?
Well, look, I think that anything like that's very exciting if it enhances our ability to understand and provide independent verification of the data that companies already say they provide on the prevalence of hate and misinformation, of being able to detect it, being able to flag it to them. But that having that data is only half the journey. The other half is for that to change behavior at the platforms. And I think that is, you know, we keep focusing on the detection part. As we show through our failure to act reports, it doesn't matter about detection. Even if you tell them about it, you knock on their door and say, we found these 100. They'll do nothing. You know, you need them then to take the baton and run with it and do something. And that's where the failure is happening right now. Right now, there's a failure to act. There's a failure of will. There's a failure of determination to deal with problems rather than our ability to detect it. But that said, if I could move to a world in which I don't have to expose human beings to hate. So my staff currently, like we have psychiatrists, we have a lot of support in place to ensure that staff aren't negatively affected by the stuff they see. It is not pleasant to look at hatred all day. It is really confusing to look at misinformation all day. You start to doubt basic facts, and that's honestly the effect on the human mind after seeing misinformation all day. And I know that from talking to my staff. But it would be a big step forwards in our ability to do that in a way that doesn't have a massive impact on human beings.
I think we have a question, by the way. Atilla Yardaş. Reddit has recently expanded their anti-hate speech policy and started to ban the slur groomer because it violates their policy on hate speech against queer people. After that, a Twitter spokesperson provided a statement that the targeted use of groomer as a slur against another user based on their perceived membership in a protected category violates the platform's hate speech policies, but Twitter always emphasizes the context, and I think this word is a buzzword for companies when it comes to their hate speech policies. What do you think about the instrumentalization of the word notion context by companies to ignore or overlook their hate speech policies?
Well, yes, and almost ideally, we've just released a report on this in the last week. I think time is very difficult for me. I always think that one day is a week. I think it was last week we released our newest report with the very well-known and well-established US LGBTQ plus rights organization, the Human Rights Campaign, on specifically the use of the term groomer and pedophile to talk about gay people. And we waited for Twitter to change their policies, and then again we tested them. After they announced the change, we found a few hundred, I think, tweets in which high-profile people had been very explicit and said that gay people are grooming children for child exploitation. We reported it to the platform, and 99% of the time they took no action. So I see this all the time talking to companies. They make a big announcement. It's Pride Month. That's why Twitter today is announcing that we will no longer tolerate people making the unfounded slur and allegation that gay people are grooming children for child sexual exploitation. And then there's no substance behind their announcement. I see this all the time. I've seen it with other platforms, including, I'm sorry to say, but Reddit as well. I say I'm sorry to say because I really like Reddit, and I think that they do genuinely try and engage with the questions. But I do remember speaking on a panel with an executive from Reddit who said to me that they'd banned the use of, I mean, this is going to sound extraordinary, they'd banned the use of the N-word on their platform. And so what I did was I literally went and searched for it and then handed my phone to them and said, how do you explain all of these then? And they said, context. And I said, okay, well, let's go through it to understand the context. The first one says, N-words should be shot. How do you explain the context there? And they don't have an answer. And that's why automated identification, the rule sets that they have at the moment just aren't working. How do you enforce values in society? How do you enforce rules like that in society? It's action, it's consequences. If anyone right now jumped on this platform and used a racial slur against me, how long do you think their job would last? Like if you did it in a meeting at work, if you used a misogynist slur in a group of friends, how many friends do you think you'd lose over it? You know, there is a fundamental difference between the way that rules are enforced and that consequences are enforced on social media platforms. The social media platforms don't just not enforce their rules, they amplify hate and misinformation. It's the exact opposite. Like there is a benefit. There's a reason I'm actually on my other screen. I have two screens. My other screen, there's stuff flashing up because the organization's always going. So I mean, I set this up 6 years ago with 2 people. We're now 21 across 2 countries with, you know, sort of, it's a lot of things happening. And Lauren Boebert, the US Congresswoman, has just announced on Twitter that she came 3rd in the list of top 10 offenders on Twitter of using the grooming slur, and that she is now going to expand her usage of it because she wants to come first next time. So she's just made that announcement on Twitter in the last few hours. And of course, Twitter's going to do nothing about it. Nothing. Because their commitment to do something about the things that they've announced is 0.
Okay. Do we have another question? If we don't have, maybe we can end. No. Okay, we don't have a question. Okay, by the way, we have a kind of upcoming elections, you know, and during the elections, I am sure that they will use social media algorithms to promote hate speech, etc. Because, you know, politicians always attack some group of people to do propaganda, and we'll see how it will happen and how they will use social media platforms.
Well, that's the real fear, is that, you know, the thing about misinformation and hate is that if you can persuade someone that black is white, and then you say, no one else is telling you that black is white, I'm the only one, I'm on your side, you know, I don't agree with the other people, that you essentially, you weaponize misinformation to create a false sense of community and adherence. Now, who's the guy who was most effective at doing that in the last 10 years? And that was Trump. You know, Trump was, I mean, everyone forgets that, like, before the election, before COVID came along, Trump was working with the anti-vaxxers. He wanted to put an anti-vaxxer in charge of the vaccine task force in 2016. And you think about the damage that that could have caused. We're going to see a lot of weaponization of hate and misinformation because it's an advantage to people. And it's really important for the future of our societies that that doesn't continue. That's why I think the work that we're doing today, the work that my team do every day, is really so valuable to our futures.
So, okay, if we don't have questions, I will end this online talk. I would like to thank you, Imran, one more time. It was a pleasure to moderate this. I don't know what we say, online talk anyway. So, and it's very nice to meet you again. Thank you for listening, all. Yasemin Hanım, eğer söyleyeceğiniz ya da eklemek istediğiniz bir şey yoksa, we can end.
Yasemin Hanım, if you don't have any additional remarks, we may end this online panel.
İmran'a ben de teşekkür
Thank you
etmek
very much indeed. I would like to join you, our moderator, by thanking Imran.
Teşekkürler. Hepinize iyi akşamlar dilerim.
And our audience as well. I wish you a good evening.
Okay. So, thank you.